The morning of March 15th, 1945, a peculiar-looking tank rolled off a cargo ship at the port of Antwerp, Belgium, serial number 0103292. The vehicle bore the official designation T26E on a -1, but the maintenance crews who would work on it over the coming days would give it a different name entirely, the Super Pershing. This single prototype tank, mounting a gun barrel so long it required a massive counterweight just to keep the turret balanced, would expose a truth that American tank designers had spent 3 years trying to ignore. The mathematics of armored protection were about to be rewritten, not through theoretical engineering in distant laboratories, but through desperate improvisation in a war zone, where German 88mm guns were still punching through American armor like it was made of tin. What made this particular tank extraordinary wasn't just the experimental .73 caliber gun protruding from its turret. It was what would happen to this vehicle over the next 2 weeks, when maintenance personnel from the 3rd Armored Division would transform it into something that officially shouldn't exist. Using welding torches, salvaged steel plates, and engineering principles that violated every regulation in the Army Technical Manual, they would create armor protection that made German anti-tank gunners question whether their weapons were malfunctioning. The tank bore witness to a problem that had plagued American armored forces since 1943. While German engineers had embraced sloped armor after encountering Soviet T-34 tanks on the Eastern Front, and while American designers had learned the same lessons from intelligence reports and battlefield observations, the institutional resistance to change within Army ground forces had delayed implementation for years. Now, in the final months of the European war, that delay was costing lives every single day. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story of American heavy tank development began not in 1945, but in the spring of 1942, when Ordnance Department engineers first proposed the T-20 medium tank series. At that moment, the M4 Sherman had just entered production, and to most Army commanders, it seemed perfectly adequate for any foreseeable combat scenario. The Sherman could defeat German Panzer III and early Panzer IV tanks. It was reliable, relatively easy to manufacture, and available in quantities that would overwhelm enemy forces through sheer numbers. But observers in North Africa were already noting troubling trends. German tank designers were adding thicker armor and longer guns to their existing platforms. The Panzer III received upgraded frontal protection. The Panzer IV, originally designed as an infantry support vehicle with a short-barreled 75mm gun, was being retrofitted with a long-barreled high-velocity weapon that could penetrate Sherman armor at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. The T-20 program began as a conservative upgrade. Engineers retained the basic Sherman configuration, but made specific improvements based on combat experience. The glacis plate thickness increased from 63mm to 76mm. The slope remained similar at 46 degrees, providing roughly the same effective thickness as the Sherman after accounting for the angle. The vehicle tested a new 76mm gun, more powerful than the Sherman's original 75mm weapon, but still fundamentally similar in concept. What made the T-20 revolutionary wasn't its armor or gun, but its automotive engineering. The tank featured a rear-mounted transmission and rear drive sprocket, eliminating the long propeller shaft that ran through the Sherman's fighting compartment. This allowed a lower hull profile, making the vehicle a smaller target. The engine, a Ford GAA V8, originally developed as a failed aircraft engine design, sat lower in the hull. The suspension used an early version of horizontal volute spring system, more robust than the vertical springs on early Shermans. But even as T-20 development proceeded through 1943, more disturbing intelligence reached American commanders. In July 1943, during Operation Citadel at Kursk, German forces deployed the Panther medium tank in significant numbers for the first time. Intelligence reports described a vehicle mounting a 75mm gun, with performance exceeding any weapon American forces had encountered. More significantly, the Panther featured heavily sloped armor that made its effective protection far exceed its actual plate thickness. The Panther's frontal glacis consisted of 80mm of armor angled at 55 degrees from vertical. This slope meant that incoming projectiles had to penetrate the equivalent of roughly 140 millimeters of armor when hitting at perpendicular angles, and even more when striking from typical combat positions. The tank weighed 45 tons, classified as a medium tank by German standards, yet its frontal protection exceeded that of the 63-ton Tiger I heavy tank with its flat 100mm armor. Soviet tank designers had pioneered sloped armor with the T-34 medium tank, which entered service in 1940. The T-34's 45mm frontal armor, angled at 60 degrees, provided effective protection equivalent to 90mm or more, depending on the angle of engagement. German tank crews had encountered T-34 seconds with shock and dismay in 1941, finding their weapons inadequate against the Soviet tank's combination of sloped armor, good mobility, and effective 76mm gun. American intelligence had detailed reports on both the T-34 and the Panther by late 1943. Engineers at Aberdeen Proving Ground conducted studies demonstrating that sloped armor provided protection far exceeding the equivalent weight of vertical armor. A tank with 100mm of armor sloped at 46 degrees offered roughly the same frontal protection as 139mm of vertical armor. At 55 degrees, like the Panther, the advantage increased further. The mathematical principles were straightforward. When a projectile strikes sloped armor, it must travel through more material because it's hitting at an angle rather than perpendicular. Additionally, the slope increases the chance that the projectile will ricochet rather than penetrate, particularly with uncapped armor-piercing rounds. The combination of increased effective thickness and deflection probability made sloped armor dramatically more efficient than vertical protection. Yet, despite this knowledge, American tank development proceeded slowly. The institutional culture within Army ground forces, particularly under Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, strongly favored the existing Sherman tank and opposed major new tank programs. McNair believed that tank destroyers, not tanks, should fight enemy armor. He argued that tanks existed primarily to support infantry and exploit breakthroughs, not to engage in tank versus tank duels. This doctrinal position had considerable merit in theory. Specialized tank destroyers could mount heavier guns on lighter chassis, providing more cost-effective anti-armor capability than expensive heavy tanks. In practice, however, the doctrine ignored battlefield reality. When German Panthers and Tigers appeared, American tank crews found themselves forced into exactly the tank versus tank engagements that doctrine said they should avoid. And in those engagements, Sherman tanks were badly outmatched. Development of the T-25 and T-26 tank series began in mid-1943 as engineers attempted to address the growing German armor threat. The T-25 mounted a 90mm gun in a new, larger turret. The T-26 added significantly thicker frontal armor, with the glacis plate increased to 102mm. Both designs retained the 46-degree slope that characterized American tank design. The T-26 series represented a fundamental shift in American tank philosophy. Previous designs had prioritized mobility and reliability over protection, accepting that American tanks would be outgunned by German heavy armor. The T-26 acknowledged that American crews deserved better protection and firepower, even if it meant sacrificing some mobility and increasing weight. The glacis armor specification of 102mm at 46 degrees provided effective protection of approximately 100-239mm. This would defeat the standard German 75mm Panzer IV gun at all but point-blank range. It would also provide reasonable protection against the 88mm guns on Tiger I tanks at medium ranges, though not at close combat distances where the Tiger's gun could generate maximum penetrating power. The 90mm M3 gun, mounted in the T-26 turret, offered performance roughly equivalent to the German 88mm Qua WK-36 gun used in the Tiger I. At 100 meters range, the M3 could penetrate 188mm of armor. At 1,000 meters, penetration dropped to 137mm. This was sufficient to defeat Tiger I frontal armor and even penetrate the Panther's frontal turret armor, though the Panther's steeply sloped glacis remained nearly invulnerable, except at very close range. Testing of T-26 prototypes at Aberdeen Proving Ground through late 1943 and early 1944 produced generally favourable results. The tank demonstrated adequate mobility, despite weighing over 40 tons. The suspension system, using torsion bars rather than the volute springs tested in earlier prototypes, provided good cross-country performance. The gun proved accurate and powerful. The armour protection represented a dramatic improvement over the Sherman, yet production authorization remained elusive. In September 1943, General Jacob Devers, head of the armoured force, advocated strongly for immediate production of the T-26E1 prototype. General McNair opposed the proposal, arguing in a letter to Devers that the M4 Sherman remained adequate for all foreseeable requirements. McNair wrote that the Sherman had been widely hailed as the best tank on the battlefield, that there appeared to be no fear among American forces of the German Tiger tank, and that tank versus tank combat was an unsound and unnecessary concept. McNair's letter, preserved in Army records at the National Archives, reveals the institutional blindness that characterized Army ground forces thinking in late 1943. At that moment, American tank crews in Italy were discovering that their 75mm guns could barely scratch Panther and Tiger armor from the front. Reports from theater commanders described growing casualties as German heavy tanks dominated engagements, yet McNair insisted that no problem existed and that the Sherman remained superior to enemy designs. Devers went over McNair's head directly to Army Chief of Staff General George Marshall. On December 16, 1943, Marshall overruled McNair and authorized production of 250 T-26E1 tanks, but the damage from months of delay was already done. Even with production authorization, tooling up factories and training workers would require additional months. The T-26 would not reach combat units until well into 1945. In late December 1943, Devers was transferred to the Mediterranean theatre to eventually command the 6th Army Group in the invasion of southern France. His departure removed the T-26 programme's most powerful advocate from the decision-making process. Further attempts were made to derail production, but continued support from Generals Marshall and Eisenhower kept the programme alive. Testing and refinement of the T-26E1 prototype proceeded slowly through early 1944. Engineers modified the transmission to handle the vehicle's weight more reliably. The suspension was refined to improve cross-country mobility. The turret design was adjusted to better accommodate the 90mm gun's recoil forces. Each modification required testing, evaluation, and approval before moving forward. The Normandy invasion on June 6, 1944, provided brutal confirmation that American tank capabilities were inadequate. In the hedgerow country of Normandy, German Panthers and Tigers engaged Sherman tanks at close range with devastating results. A single Panther in a concealed position could destroy multiple Shermans before being forced to withdraw. Tiger tanks operating in small numbers dominated entire sectors, forcing American forces to call in massive artillery strikes or air support to neutralize threats that should have been handled by friendly armor. Tank crews reported that the Sherman's 75mm gun could not penetrate Panther frontal armor at any practical combat range. The newer 76mm gun, which began reaching units in July 1944, could penetrate Panther turret armor, but not the heavily sloped glacis plate. Against Tiger tanks, the 76mm gun performed adequately against frontal turret armor, but struggled against the hull. Against the Tiger II, which began appearing in small numbers in August 1944, American tank guns were almost completely ineffective against frontal armor. The solution American units developed was numerical superiority and tactical coordination. Multiple Shermans would engage a single German heavy tank, attempting to maneuver for flank shots, while accepting that some American tanks would be destroyed in the process. Artillery and air support would be called in whenever possible. Tank destroyers mounting 90mm guns would engage from concealed positions. These tactics worked, but at a cost measured in destroyed tanks and dead crews. Reports from Normandy finally broke through the institutional resistance at Army ground forces. In August 1944, production of the T-26E3, the refined production version of the T-26E1, received final authorization. The Grand Blanc tank arsenal, operated by Fisher Body Division of General Motors, would serve as the primary production facility. The Detroit tank arsenal, operated by Chrysler, would provide additional capacity. Production began in November 1944. 10 tanks were completed that first month. The production rate increased to 32 in December and 70 in January 1945. Even with this acceleration, months would pass before significant numbers reached combat units. The delay meant that the vast majority of American tank crews would fight the entire European campaign in Sherman tanks, accepting the risks that inadequate armor protection imposed. The first T-26E3 tanks, completed in November and December 1944, underwent final testing and preparation through late 1944 and early January 1945. In late December, 20 tanks were selected for immediate shipment to Europe under a program called the Zebra Mission, led by General Gladion Barnes, Chief of the Research and Development Section of Army Ordnance. The Zebra Mission served multiple purposes. It would provide combat evaluation of the new tank under actual battlefield conditions. It would demonstrate to theater commanders that improved armor was finally arriving. It would test logistics and maintenance requirements for the T-26E3. And perhaps most importantly, it would boost morale among tank crews who had spent months fighting in vehicles they knew were inadequate. The 20 tanks shipped from the United States in late December 1944, arriving at the port of Antwerp in mid-January 1945. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in Europe, assigned the tanks to 12th Army Group under General Omar Bradley. Bradley split them between the 3rd Armored Division and 9th Armored Division, both part of 1st Army. Tank crews selected to receive the new T-26E3S underwent abbreviated training in early February 1945. The tanks were heavier than Sherman's, less maneuverable in some situations, but far better protected and armed. The 90mm gun required different techniques than the 75 or 76mm weapons crews were accustomed to. The ammunition was larger and heavier, requiring different loading procedures. The entire fighting compartment layout differed from the Sherman, requiring crews to adapt to new working positions. Among the 20 T-26E3 tanks shipped to Europe in January 1945 was serial number 0103292. The very first production T-26E1 pilot vehicle, which had been modified to mount an experimental long-barreled 90mm gun. This tank, designated T-26E on a -1 to distinguish it from standard T-26E3, production vehicles mounted the T-15E1 gun, 73 calibers in length compared to the standard M3 gun's 53 calibers. The T-15E1 gun was a formidable weapon. With a muzzle velocity of 1140 meters per second when firing APCR ammunition, it could penetrate the Panther's frontal armor at ranges up to 2,400 meters. In testing at Aberdeen Proving Ground, a T-15E1 shell had completely penetrated a Jagdpanzer IV tank destroyer from front to rear, the projectile entering the frontal armor, passing through the entire vehicle, and exiting through the Keist rear plate before burying itself in the ground. The extreme length of the T-15E one-gun barrel, nearly 6.5 meters long, created significant balance problems. Engineers added a massive counterweight to the left side of the gun mantlet to keep the turret from becoming nose-heavy. Even with this counterweight, the gun required stronger elevation mechanisms and turret locks than standard M26 production tanks. The ammunition used single-piece shells, 1,300 millimeters long, difficult to handle in the cramped turret and challenging to store. The T-26E on a -1 arrived at the port of Antwerp on March 15th, 1945, one of the last pieces of equipment sent under the Zebra mission. By this date, most of the original 20 T-26E3 tanks had already seen action. Several had engaged German armor with favorable results. The tank, named Fireball, had been knocked out by a Tiger but later repaired and returned to service. Another T-26E3 had destroyed a Tiger I and II Panzer IV tanks in a single engagement. The new tanks were proving their worth, but they were also revealing vulnerabilities. The T-26E3's armor, while dramatically better than the Sherman, still could not guarantee protection against German 88mm guns at close range. The Tiger's KWK-36 gun and the even more powerful KWK-43 gun on the Tiger II could penetrate T-26E3 frontal armor under certain conditions, particularly at ranges below 500 meters, or when striking the lower glacis plate, rather than the heavily sloped upper glacis. Personnel from the 3rd Armored Division's Maintenance Battalion examined the T-26E on a -1 shortly after it arrived. The tank would be assigned to one of the division's tank companies, but first it would undergo modifications that no Army regulation authorized and no technical manual described. Using materials scavenged from the battlefield and welding techniques learned through months of field repairs, maintenance crews would transform this experimental tank into something that would challenge every assumption German anti-tank gunners held about American armor capabilities. The modifications began with the hull. Maintenance personnel located 2 steel boiler plates, each 38mm thick, salvaged from a destroyed industrial facility. These plates were cut to fit the T-26E1-1's glacis armor, then welded onto the existing 102mm frontal plate. The placement was crucial. Rather than simply adding thickness directly over the original armor, the plates were mounted with spacing between them and the hull, and at an even greater slope than the underlying 46-degree glacis. This created improvised spaced armor, a concept that German engineers had been experimenting with for months. The spacing between the outer plates and the original hull armor meant that any penetrating projectile would have to defeat multiple layers of steel separated by air gaps. Each layer would erode the projectile's energy, potentially causing it to tumble or break up before reaching the hull proper. For shaped charge weapons like the German Panzerfaust, the spacing would prove even more effective, as the air gap would disrupt the molten jet before it could penetrate the main armor. The added protection was substantial. The original glacis provided 102mm of armor at 46 degrees, equivalent to approximately 100 to 39mm of vertical armor. The addition of 2 38mm plates brought the total thickness to 178mm, but the spacing and increased slope made the effective protection even greater. Calculations suggested that the modified glacis could withstand the German 88mm KWK-36 gun even at point-blank range under most impact angles. The turret received similar treatment, though with different materials. Maintenance crews had located a destroyed Panther tank nearby, its turret blown off, but with some armor plates still intact. They cut away a section of the Panther's frontal turret armor, 80mm of rolled homogeneous armor, and shaped it to fit over the T-26E1's gun mantlet. 3 holes were cut in this plate, one for the gun barrel, one for the gunner's sight, and one for the coaxial machine gun. This additional armor transformed the mantlet into one of the most heavily protected areas of any American tank in the European theater. The original mantlet provided roughly 76mm of protection. The added 80mm Panther plate brought effective thickness to over 150mm in some areas. When combined with the extreme slope and curvature of the mantlet, this made frontal turret penetration extremely difficult for any German weapon, except at very close range with premium ammunition. The modifications added approximately 5 tons to the tank's weight. To balance this extra weight on the front, additional plates were welded to the turret's sides and rear, creating what looked like armored ears protecting the turret's flanks. The overlapping plates created crude spaced armor on the turret sides as well, providing enhanced protection against flank shots that would normally penetrate with ease. The visual result was striking. The T-26E1 no longer looked like a production tank. The welded plates gave it a crude, improvised appearance that seemed more appropriate to a desperate last stand than to modern armored warfare. Soldiers who saw the tank christened it the Super Pershing, a name that would stick in historical records. Others called it the Frankenstein tank because it appeared to be assembled from parts of dead vehicles, which in a sense it was. but the appearance didn't matter. What mattered was whether the modifications would work under combat conditions, whether the improvised armor would actually stop German 88mm shells, and whether this single experimental tank could prove that American armor protection could match German capabilities when engineers were willing to break regulations and think creatively. The crew assigned to the Super Pershing underwent additional training with their modified vehicle in late March 1945. They practiced loading the long single-piece ammunition for the T-15E1 gun in the cramped turret. They learned how the added weight affected the tank's handling and mobility. They test-fired the weapon at range targets, confirming that the gun's incredible penetrating power was not just theoretical, but could be applied with accuracy in combat conditions. By early April 1945, the Super Pershing was ready for combat deployment. The tank would join 3rd Armoured Division units, pushing into central Germany, fighting in the final battles as Allied forces closed in on Berlin from the west and the Soviets advanced from the east. In this environment, the Super Pershing would finally answer the question that had driven its creation. Could American armor engineering, when freed from institutional constraints and empowered by field improvisation, create protection that German weapons could not defeat? The week of April 8th through 15th, 1945, central Germany. The Super Pershing moved through the rubble-strewn streets of Dessau with its crew scanning for threats that could emerge from any building, any alleyway, any pile of debris large enough to conceal an anti-tank gun. The war was entering its final phase, but German resistance remained fierce in scattered pockets, particularly where heavy armor could be deployed to maximum advantage. The 3rd Armoured Division had been pushing eastward for weeks, grinding through increasingly desperate German defences. By early April, the division operated deep in German territory, encountering a mix of regular Wehrmacht units, Waffen-SS formations, and improvised battle groups thrown together from whatever personnel and equipment remained available. The composition of German armoured forces had changed dramatically from even a few months earlier. Many units that nominally fielded Panthers and Tigers actually operated with whatever vehicles could still move and fight. The crew of the Super Pershing had already engaged several targets since entering combat in late March. They had destroyed 2 unidentified German tanks at medium range, taking advantage of the T-15E1 gun's superior penetration to defeat enemy armour before the opposing crews could effectively return fire. They had provided fire support to infantry units clearing fortified positions, using the 90mm gun's high-explosive shells to demolish buildings and bunkers. But they had not yet faced the test that would validate or disprove the improvised armour modifications. On April 11th, that test came. The Super Pershing was supporting an advance through an industrial area on the outskirts of Dessau when the crew spotted movement, approximately 800 metres ahead. The commander identified the target through his optics, a German tank, hull down behind rubble, presenting only its turret. The distinctive profile suggested a Panther, possibly a late-model Ausf-G variant based on the smooth mantlet design. The German tank had positioned itself perfectly, maximizing its frontal armor advantage while minimizing exposure. The Super Pershing's gunner traversed onto the target, placing the aiming reticle on the junction between the Panther's turret and hull. At this range, the T-15E1 gun could penetrate the Panther's frontal turret armor with certainty, but hitting a partially concealed target at 800 meters required precision. The gunner made minute adjustments for range and wind, then fired. The 90mm APCR round left the barrel at 1140 meters per second, crossing the distance to target in less than 1 second. The projectile struck the Panther's turret at the junction with the hull exactly where aimed. The penetration was catastrophic. The crew reported later that all 3 rounds they fired penetrated the Panther's armor, 1 striking below the gun shield and 2 hitting the turret sides as the tank attempted to traverse away. The side hits passed completely through the vehicle and exited the opposite side, a demonstration of the T-15E1 gun's devastating penetrating power. 4 members of the Panther's crew successfully bailed out before the tank was consumed by fire. The 5th crewman, most likely the driver trapped in his forward position, did not escape. Signal Corps cameraman Technical Sergeant Jim Bates, attached to 3rd Armoured Division to document the new T-26E3 tanks in combat, recorded the engagement on film. The footage would later become some of the only visual documentation of the Super Pershing in actual combat. But the engagement that would truly test the improvised armour modifications occurred 2 days later, on April 13th. The Super Pershing was advancing through a heavily damaged urban area when German forces counterattacked with armour support. Intelligence reports later suggested the attack involved elements of a Schwerpanzerabteilung, a heavy tank battalion, though the specific unit identification remained uncertain. What was certain was that the opposing tank was considerably more dangerous than the Panther encountered 2 days earlier. The German tank appeared suddenly from a concealed position, its massive gun barrel immediately recognizable. The crew identified it as a Tiger II, the heaviest and most powerful tank Germany produced in significant numbers. The Tiger II mounted an 88mm KWK-43 gun, far more powerful than the KWK-36 on the Tiger I, with penetrating performance that exceeded any tank gun the Western Allies fielded. At combat ranges, the KWK-43 could defeat virtually any Allied armour, including the T-26E3's frontal protection. The Tiger II's armour was equally formidable. Its frontal glacis consisted of 150mm of armour, sloped at 50 degrees, providing effective protection exceeding 200mm. Its frontal turret armour reached 180mm. American tank guns, even the 90mm M3, struggled to penetrate Tiger II frontal armour except at very close range with premium ammunition. The Super Pershing's T-15E1 gun could penetrate the Tiger II frontally, but the engagement would test whether the American tank could survive long enough to take the shot. The Tiger II fired first. At a range estimated at 500 meters, the German gunner placed his shot directly on the Super Pershing's frontal glacis, striking the improvised boilerplate armour that maintenance crews had welded on weeks earlier in Belgium. The 88mm shell, likely a standard Panzergranate 39/43 armour-piercing round, struck the outer armour plate at high velocity. The crew felt the massive impact as the shell hit. In a standard T-26E3, or certainly in a Sherman, such a hit at this range would almost certainly penetrate, killing or wounding crew members, and potentially igniting ammunition or fuel. But the improvised spaced armour performed exactly as the maintenance crews had hoped. The outer boilerplate deflected the shell's energy, causing it to ricochet away without penetrating to the main hull armour beneath. The Super Pershing had survived a direct hit from the most powerful tank gun Germany fielded. The gunner, recovering from the shock of being hit, quickly reacquired the target. The Tiger II was attempting to reverse into cover, its commander apparently surprised that the American tank remained operational after a direct frontal hit. The Super Pershing's gunner fired, aiming for the Tiger II's frontal turret, where the armour, though thick, was not sloped as dramatically as the hull. The T-15E1's APCR round struck the Tiger II's turret front. Reports from the engagement, later, compiled from crew debriefings and examination of the destroyed German tank, indicated that the round penetrated, though whether it was this shot or a subsequent hit that actually destroyed the vehicle remained unclear. What was certain was that the Tiger II burned, its crew abandoning the vehicle as ammunition began cooking off from internal fires. The Super Pershing had accomplished something remarkable. It had engaged and defeated a Tiger II in a direct frontal duel, absorbing a hit from the German tank's main gun without suffering penetration, then returning fire with lethal effect. No other American tank in the European theatre could make that claim with certainty. Shermans that encountered Tiger IIs survived only through superior numbers, tactical surprise, or by achieving flank shots. Even standard T-26E3 Pershings faced serious risk in frontal engagements with Tiger IIs at typical combat ranges. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable Tiger notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The engagement demonstrated conclusively that the improvised armour modifications worked. The spaced armour configuration, created by maintenance crews working with salvaged materials and field welding equipment, provided protection that matched or exceeded purpose-built German heavy tank armour. The concept was not new. German engineers had experimented with spaced armor and side skirts for years, but applying it successfully to an American tank through field modifications proved that the principle was sound and that American crews didn't need to accept inferior protection as inevitable. The Super Pershing participated in one additional confirmed engagement before the end of combat operations in early May. The crew reportedly destroyed another unidentified German armoured vehicle, possibly a Panther based on descriptions, though documentation of this engagement was less complete than the earlier battles. By late April, German organised resistance was collapsing rapidly as Allied forces from the west and Soviet forces from the east compressed the remaining Wehrmacht units into an ever-shrinking pocket. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe ended with the Super Pershing having participated in a total of only 3 or 4 confirmed engagements over a period of approximately 4 weeks. This limited combat service reflected not any deficiency in the vehicle, but simply the timing of its arrival. By April 1945, German armoured forces were shadows of their former strength, operating with fuel shortages, ammunition shortages, and inadequate replacement personnel. Opportunities for tank versus tank combat had become relatively rare compared to the intense armoured battles of 1944. The broader story of the T-26E3 tanks that reached Europe in early 1945 revealed both the potential and the limitations of the TACE design. A total of 310 T-26E3s were shipped to Europe before VE Day, though only approximately 200 were issued to combat units. The remainder served as reserves or were still in transit when hostilities ended. Of those 200 issued to combat units, perhaps 20 to 30 saw actual combat against German forces. The combat record of these tanks demonstrated clear superiority over German armour in most engagements. T-26E3s destroyed multiple Panthers and Tigers with favourable loss ratios. The 90mm M3 gun proved capable of defeating German heavy tank frontal armour at ranges where German guns could also penetrate the T-26E3, creating a more balanced engagement than Sherman crews had experienced. The improved armour protection reduced casualties and increased crew confidence. But the T-26E3 also revealed significant shortcomings. The tank was underpowered, using the same Ford GAF engine that powered the M4A3 Sherman, despite weighing nearly 12,000 kilograms more. This created a poor power-to-weight ratio that limited mobility, particularly on soft ground or steep slopes. The transmission, while generally reliable, strained under the vehicle's weight. Crews reported that the T-26E3 could not keep pace with Shermans during rapid advances and struggled when crossing muddy terrain or climbing hills. The late arrival of the T-26E3 in the European theatre, and the limited numbers available before the war's end, meant that the vast majority of American tank crews fought the entire campaign in Sherman tanks. Approximately 50,000 Sherman tanks of all types were produced during the war years. Against this number, the 200 T-26E3s in combat represented a tiny fraction of American armoured strength. For most crew members, the promise of improved protection remained just that, a promise unfulfilled until after the shooting stopped. The question that historians would debate for decades was whether earlier introduction of the T-26 design could have significantly affected the campaign in northwest Europe. If production had begun in early 1944 instead of November of that year, thousands of T-26 tanks could have participated in the Normandy invasion and subsequent operations. Tank casualties would likely have been lower, crew confidence would have been higher, engagements with German heavy armour would have been less one-sided. The arguments against this scenario emphasized industrial and logistical constraints. Producing the T-26 would have required diverting manufacturing capacity from Sherman production, potentially reducing the overall number of tanks available. The T-26 required different spare parts, different ammunition, and different maintenance procedures, complicating logistics. Training crews and maintenance personnel on the new vehicle would have taken time and resources. These were legitimate concerns that partially justified Army ground forces' resistance to the program. But these arguments failed to account for the human cost of delay. Every Sherman crew that encountered a Panther or Tiger in 1944 knew their tank was inadequate. They knew that German guns could penetrate their armor at ranges where their own guns were ineffective. They knew that survival often depended on luck, tactical skill, and willingness to accept casualties while maneuvering for advantageous positions. Giving these crews better equipment earlier would have saved lives, even if it complicated logistics and reduced total tank numbers. The institutional failure that delayed T-26 production illustrated a broader problem in military procurement and development. Organizations tend to resist change, even when evidence clearly demonstrates that change is necessary. The Army Ground Forces leadership in 1943 and 1944 had invested enormous resources in Sherman production and had built an entire tactical doctrine around the tank's capabilities. Limitations. Admitting that a fundamentally different tank was needed would have required acknowledging that previous decisions were flawed. General McNair's opposition to the T-26 was not simple stubbornness or incompetence. He genuinely believed that the Sherman was adequate and that specialized tank destroyers represented a more efficient solution to the problem of German heavy armor. His position was supported by some combat reports from North Africa and Italy that emphasized the Sherman's reliability and ease of maintenance. But McNair's position also reflected institutional bias and resistance to information that contradicted established doctrine. The transformation of American tank development philosophy after 1945 demonstrated how thoroughly battlefield experience had undermined pre-war assumptions. In March 1945, the T-26E3 was officially designated the M26 and named Pershing after General John J. Pershing, commander of American forces in World War I. The designation change from heavy tank to medium tank reflected evolving understanding of where the vehicle fit in the armored force structure, though the change was largely semantic. Post-war, approximately 800 M26 tanks were upgraded with improved engines and transmissions and redesignated as M46 Patton tanks. The M46 addressed the M26's most serious deficiency, its inadequate power-to-weight ratio, by installing a more powerful Continental AV 1790 engine and improved Allison CD 850 transmission. The result was a tank with the M26's protection and firepower, but with mobility that better matched its weight. The M46 served as the foundation for the entire Patton series of tanks that would dominate American armored forces for decades. The M47 Patton, introduced in 1951, retained the M26's basic hull and suspension, while adding a new turret and improved fire control. The M48 Patton, entering service in 1953, was a more thorough redesign, but still reflected the fundamental layout established by the M26. The M60 Patton, the final evolution of this lineage, served with American forces into the 1990s and remains in service with various nations today. All of these tanks incorporated the basic design principles that the M26 had established: heavily sloped frontal armor, a large turret capable of mounting powerful guns, torsion bar suspension, and a rear-mounted engine with rear drive sprocket. The low hull profile that characterized the M26 became standard for all subsequent American tank designs. The concept of balanced protection, firepower, and mobility, rather than optimizing any single characteristic, defined American tank philosophy for the Cold War period. The Super Pershing's unique story ended not with glory but with bureaucratic anticlimax. After the war, the vehicle was returned to the United States for evaluation. The improvised armor modifications were documented and photographed, providing engineers with data on how field modifications could enhance protection. But the single-piece ammunition for the T-15E1 gun proved too cumbersome for practical use, and the extreme length of the gun barrel created handling difficulties that outweighed its penetration advantages. 25 production T-26E4 tanks were authorized in March 1945, intended to replace regular M26S on the production line with the long-barreled gun version. But the war's end in May eliminated the urgent need for production Super Pershings. Only the 25 authorized vehicles were completed, and these served primarily as test vehicles for future development programs. The T-15E2 gun, a modified version using two-piece ammunition that was easier to handle, was tested in several of these vehicles but never entered widespread service. The original Super Pershing, serial number 01-03292, eventually ended up at Fort Knox, Kentucky, where it was preserved as a historical artifact. For decades, it sat largely forgotten, one of dozens of tanks in storage at various Army installations. In recent years, the tank has received more attention from historians and preservationists who recognize its unique place in American armor development. It represents not just a technological achievement, but a cultural moment when field personnel took initiative to solve problems that institutional bureaucracy had failed to address. The question of whether improvised spaced armor could have been more widely adopted in 1945 remains intriguing. Maintenance units in the field had the skills and equipment to weld additional armor plates onto existing tanks. Salvaged German armor plates were available wherever destroyed. Panthers and Tigers littered the battlefield. The weight penalty, while significant, was not prohibitive for tanks operating in the final offensive into Germany, where tactical mobility mattered less than frontal protection. But widespread field modifications would have created enormous complications. Each modified tank would have different armor configurations, depending on what materials were available and what the local maintenance crews decided to weld where. Spare parts and maintenance would become nightmares, as each tank became effectively unique. Quality control would be impossible to enforce. Structural stress from welded-on armor could cause hull cracking or other failures that wouldn't become apparent until the tank had seen significant service. Army ordnance officials, confronted with the possibility of field armor modifications spreading throughout armored units, chose to discourage the practice rather than trying to standardize it. Official guidance emphasized that tanks should be used as designed and that unauthorized modifications could void warranties and create safety hazards. This was sound bureaucratic policy, but it also reflected the same institutional conservatism that had delayed T-26 production in the first place. The Korean War, beginning in June 1950, provided the next major test of American tank design. M26. Pershing tanks served extensively in Korea, facing Soviet-built T-3485 tanks used by North Korean and Chinese forces. The M26 proved superior to the T-3485 inches direct engagements, with the 90mm gun easily penetrating T-34 armor, while the Soviet tank's 85mm gun struggled to penetrate the Pershing's frontal protection. But Korea also highlighted the M26's continuing mobility problems. The mountainous Korean terrain, with steep grades and narrow roads, challenged the underpowered Pershing. Crews reported difficulty climbing hills and maintaining formation during movement. The M46 Patton, with its more powerful engine, performed significantly better in Korean conditions. By late 1951, most M26S in Korea had been replaced by M46S or were being upgraded to M46 standard. A comprehensive survey conducted in 1954 documented 119 tank versus tank actions involving U.S. Army and Marine units during the Korean War. Of these engagements, M26 and M46 tanks participated in approximately 32%, M4A3E8 Shermans in 50%, and various other types in the remainder. The survey confirmed that M26 and M46 tanks were overmatches for the T-3485, with the 90mm HVAP round capable of penetrating completely through a T-3485 from glacis to rear at point-blank range. The legacy of the M26 Pershing extended beyond its direct descendants in the Patton family. The tank represented a philosophical shift in how American forces approached armored warfare. Pre-war doctrine had emphasized speed and reliability over protection, accepting that American tanks would be lighter and more vulnerable than enemy designs. The M26 demonstrated that American industry could produce heavily armored, powerfully armed tanks when the need was recognized and institutional resistance was overcome. This lesson proved crucial for Cold War tank development. When the Soviet Union fielded the T-54 medium tank in the late 1940s, American designers did not repeat the mistake of assuming that lighter, more mobile tanks would be adequate. Instead, development of the M48 and later the M60 emphasized matching Soviet armor and firepower while maintaining acceptable mobility. The willingness to build heavier, more capable tanks reflected lessons learned through the painful experience of facing German heavy armor with inadequate equipment. The Super Pershing story also illustrated the importance of field innovation and the willingness of soldiers to improvise solutions when official channels failed to provide adequate equipment. The maintenance crews who welded boilerplates and salvaged Panther armor onto the T-26E on a -1 were not following regulations or official procedures. They were solving a problem using available materials and their own engineering judgment. Their work created a tank that could survive hits from the most powerful German weapons, demonstrating that protection was achievable when personnel had the freedom and resources to pursue innovative solutions. Modern tank design continues to grapple with many of the same challenges that confronted M26 designers in 1944 and 45. How much weight should be devoted to armor versus mobility? Should armor be optimized for frontal protection or more evenly distributed? How can new threats like anti-tank guided missiles and top-attack weapons be defeated? The fundamental tension between protection, firepower, and mobility remains as relevant today as it was 8 decades ago. The improvised spaced armor on the Super Pershing anticipated modern reactive armor and composite armor systems that use similar principles. Modern tanks employ explosive reactive armor that disrupts incoming projectiles, composite armor with layers of different materials separated by air gaps or other spacing, and active protection systems that intercept threats before they reach the armor. All of these technologies reflect the basic insight that the maintenance crews in Belgium demonstrated in March 1945. Defeating penetrators requires more than just thick steel. It requires intelligent arrangements of materials that force projectiles to defeat multiple layers. The M26 Pershing's combat service in World War II was brief and limited, but its impact on American tank design was profound and lasting. The tank proved that American industry could produce armor equal to or better than the best German designs when the institutional will existed to do so. It demonstrated that heavy armor and powerful guns were not incompatible with American manufacturing capabilities or logistics, and in the unique case of the Super Pershing, it showed that field innovation could create protection that defeated the most powerful enemy weapons. The crews who fought in M26 Pershings during the final weeks of World War II finally had equipment that matched their training and courage. They no longer faced German heavy tanks with the sick certainty that the enemy could kill them before they could effectively return fire. The psychological impact of having adequate protection and firepower was as significant as the tactical advantages the improved equipment provided. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.